Human Rights Council, 59th session, 16 June, 11 June 2025. Agenda item 7, Human Rights Situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories. From economy of occupation to economy of genocide. A report of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967, Francesca Albanese. Summary. In the present report, the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967 investigates the corporate machinery sustaining the Israeli settler colonial project of displacement and replacement of the Palestinians in the occupied territory. While political leaders and governments shirk their obligations, far too many corporate entities have profited from the Israeli economy of illegal occupation, apartheid, and now genocide. The complicity exposed by the report is just the tip of the iceberg, and it will not happen without holding the private sector accountable, including its executives. International law recognizes varied degrees of responsibility. Each requires scrutiny and accountability, particularly in this case, where people's self-determination and very existence are at stake. This is a necessary step to end the genocide and dismantle the global system that has allowed it. 1. Introduction. 1. Colonial endeavors and associated genocides have historically been driven and enabled by the corporate sector. Commercial interests have contributed to the dispossession of indigenous people of their lands, a mode of domination known as colonial racial capitalism. The same is true of Israeli colonization of Palestinian lands, its expansion into the occupied Palestinian territory, and its institutionalization of a regime of settler colonial apartheid. After denying Palestinian self-determination for decades, Israel is now imperiling the very existence of the Palestinian people in Palestine. 2. The role of corporate entities in sustaining the illegal Israeli occupation and its ongoing genocidal campaign in Gaza is the subject of the present investigative report, which is focused on how corporate interests underpin Israeli settler colonial twofold logic of displacement and replacement aimed at dispossessing and erasing Palestinians from their lands. The Special Rapporteur discusses corporate entities in various sectors: arms manufacturers, tech firms, building and construction companies, extractive and service industries, banks, pension funds, insurers, universities, and charities. These entities enable the denial of self-determination and other structural violations in the occupied Palestinian territory, including occupation, annexation, and crimes of apartheid and genocide, as well as a long list of ancillary crimes and human rights violations, from discrimination, wanton destruction, forced displacement, and pillage, or extrajudicial killing and starvation. 3. Had proper human rights due diligence been undertaken, corporate entities would have long ago disengaged from Israeli occupation. Instead, post-October 2023, corporate actors have contributed to the acceleration of the displacement-replacement process throughout the military campaign that has pulverized Gaza and displaced the largest number of Palestinians in the West Bank since 1967. 4. While it is impossible to fully capture the scale and extent of decades of corporate connivance in the exploitation of the occupied Palestinian territory, the present report exposes the integration of the economies of settler colonial occupation and genocide. In it, the Special Rapporteur calls for accountability for corporate entities and their executives at both domestic and international levels, commercial endeavors enabling and profiting from the obliteration of innocent people's lives must cease. Corporate entities must refuse to complicit in human rights violations and international crimes or be held to account. 2. Methodology. 5. Corporate entities in the present report refers to business enterprises, multinational corporations, for-profit and not-for-profit entities, whether private, public, or state-owned. Corporate responsibility applies regardless of the size, sector, operational context, ownership, and structure of the entity. 6. In the report, the Special Rapporteur builds on extensive literature, especially by civil society and by the working group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations and other businesses, enterprises, on how Israel has created and maintained its own economy through the occupation and a captive economy for the Palestinians. 7. The Special Rapporteur also builds upon and situates within the broader matrix of the unlawful Israeli occupation the database established by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, pursuant to Human Rights Council Resolutions 3136 and 5325. The OHCHR database lists only business enterprises that have directly and indirectly enabled, facilitated, and profited from the construction and growth of the settlements. 8. The Special Rapporteur developed a database of approximately 1,000 corporate entities from the unprecedented number of submissions received, more than 200, following her call for input when preparing the investigation. This helped map how corporate entities worldwide have implicated in human rights violations and international crimes in the occupied territory. Over 45 entities named in the report have been duly informed of the fact that led the Special Rapporteur to formulate a series of allegations. 15 replied. The complex web of corporate structures and the often obscured links between parents and subsidiaries, franchises, joint ventures, licenses, etc., implicate many more. The investigation behind the present report demonstrates the lengths to which corporations will go to conceal their complicity. 9. The report is complemented by the attached annex, which provides an overview of the relevant legal framework. 3. Legal context. 10. The law governing corporate responsibility has deep roots in the historic relationship between violent dispossession and private power and the legacy of corporate collusion with sexual colonialism and racial segregation. 11. Early charter companies, granted broad state-like powers, gradually evolved into private, limited liability corporations as intercolonial trade grew vital to European economies. Colonial powers continued to rely on these relationships to outsource, obscure, and avoid accountability for the dispossession and enslavement of indigenous people and the expropriation of their resources. Corporations have not only inherited the benefits of this legal veil of separation, but have also emerged as shapers of international law. 12. Today, some corporate conglomerates exceed the gross domestic product, GDP, of entire sovereign states, sometimes wielding more power, political, economic, and discursive, than states themselves. Corporations enjoy increasing recognition as rights holders with still insufficient corresponding obligations. The asymmetry of immense power without sufficiently justiciable accountability exposes a fundamental global governance gap. 13. Corporations and their home states, primarily global minority states, continue to exploit structural inequalities rooted in colonial dispossession. Meanwhile, weaker regulatory systems in formerly colonized states, and development in investment imperatives mean corporations often evade accountability. 14. Nevertheless, important precedents exist. The post-Holocaust industrialist trials, such as the I.G. Farben trial, laid the groundwork for recognizing the international criminal responsibility of corporate executives for participation in international crimes. By addressing corporate complicity in apartheid, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa helped shed corporate responsibility for human rights violations. Increasing domestic and international litigation signal a growing trend toward corporate accountability. 15. The case of Palestine further tests international standards. 16. Today, the guiding principles on business and human rights set out the normative framework for states and corporate entities' compliance with international law. States have the primary obligation to prevent, investigate, punish, and remedy human rights abuses by the third parties and may breach their obligations if they fail to do so. The guiding principles crystallize the human rights standards applicable to corporate conduct that apply regardless of whether states uphold their primary obligations. International humanitarian law and criminal law also confer specific obligations and liabilities on private actors, with domestic jurisdictions primarily responsible for enforcement. 17. The guiding principles establish a continuum of responsibilities depending on whether corporate entities cause, contribute to, or are directly linked with adverse human rights impacts. In conflicts, businesses must observe heightened human rights due diligence to identify concerns and adjust their conduct. The liability of corporate entities will be determined by their actions and by the human rights impact. Due diligence is not sufficient to absolve corporations of liability. At a minimum, corporate entities directly linked to human rights impacts must exercise leverage or consider termination of their activities or relationships. Failure to act accordingly may give rise to liability. Where violations constitute crimes, corporate executives and increasingly entities themselves may be held accountable for their knowledge of and material contribution to crimes. In the occupied Palestinian territory, building on decades of documented human rights violations and crimes, recent judicial developments leave no room for doubt that corporate engagement with any components of the occupation is connected with violations of just cogent norms and international crimes, see Annex, citing racial segregation and apartheid, violations of the right to self-determination, and the prohibition on the use of force. The International Court of Justice unequivocally affirmed the illegality of the presence of Israel, including its military presence, colonies, and its infrastructure and resource control. Furthermore, the atrocities committed since October 2023 triggered proceedings for genocide before the International Court of Justice and for war crimes and crimes against humanity before the International Criminal Court. The International Court of Justice has ordered Israel to stop creating life-destroying conditions and recently reminded states of their international obligations to avoid transferring arms that might be used to violate international conventions. These decisions place on corporate entities a prima facie responsibility to not engage and or to withdraw totally and unconditionally from any associated dealings, and to ensure that any engagement with Palestinians enables their self-determination. 20. Where corporate entities continue their activities and relationships with Israel with its economy, military and public and private sectors connected to the occupied Palestinian territory, they may be found to have knowingly contributed to a. violations of the Palestinian right to self-determination, b. annexation of Palestinian territory, maintenance of an unlawful occupation and therefore the crime of aggression and associated human rights violations, c. crimes of apartheid and genocide, d. other ancillary crimes and violations. 21. Both criminal and civil laws in various jurisdictions can be invoked to hold corporate entities or their executives accountable for violation of human rights and or crimes under international law.